The first time Emily Carter saw her name in lights, it wasn't on a billboard or a theater marquee, it was on a cheap plastic sign taped crookedly above a bar stage in a city that wasn't home. For a girl who'd grown up in a one-road town where Friday nights meant the same diner, the same faces, and the same stories, it still felt like a miracle. Emily had spent her childhood in Maple Ridge, a place where everyone knew everyone and nothing ever really changed. Her mother worked double shifts at a grocery store, her father drifted in and out of construction jobs, and the town's biggest event was the annual summer fair, where she'd once sung in front of a small crowd and felt, for the first time, that eyes were on her for a reason. She learned early that charm was a kind of currency. At school, she was the girl who stayed late to help with stage decorations, who learned every line of every play even when she wasn't the lead. At home, she watched talent shows on TV, mouthing along to every winner's speech. Fame, to Emily, wasn't just about attention. It was escape. It was proof she could be more than a forgotten girl from a forgotten town. By 22, she had saved enough from waitressing and singing in local bars to buy a one-way ticket to another life. She chose London because it sounded dramatic when she said it out loud. The city felt like the opposite of Maple Ridge, loud, crowded, anonymous. Neon signs flickered over wet sidewalks, buses rolled past in endless red lines, and every night, behind glowing pub windows, someone was already living the life she wanted. Those first months were harder than she imagined. She rented a tiny room above a fish and chip shop that always smelled faintly of grease and vinegar. She auditioned for anything that would take her, background roles, tiny parts in music videos, lounge singing in hotel bars. Sometimes she landed a gig. More often she went home late, clutching a rejection and forcing herself to believe it meant she was close. Her social media told a different story. There, she was constantly on set, always in meetings, posting carefully chosen snapshots of city lights and studio halls that made it seem like success was just out of frame. Back home, friends commented with hearts and fire emojis. Her mother wrote, "So proud of you, Em." Emily clung to those comments like proof that this gamble hadn't been a mistake. But beneath the filtered photos, the truth was simple and cruel. The money was running out, the calls weren't coming, and the city that once felt like a promise was starting to feel like a trap. Then she met Daniel Reeves. It happened at a hotel bar near Kensington, one of the few places that still hired her to sing on quiet weekday nights. The carpet was patterned and expensive, the air cool and perfumed, the kind of place where conversations hovered above a soft piano line and waiters moved like ghosts. That evening, Emily wore her best red dress, one she'd bought second-hand and tailored herself. Under the warm lights, her hair caught a soft shine, and the microphone felt familiar and safe in her hand. Halfway through a slow, smoky cover, she noticed him. He sat at a corner table, alone, a crystal glass in front of him. His suit was dark, perfectly cut, the kind that never wrinkled. Silver threaded his hair at the temples, giving him a distinguished look that drew the eye. He didn't check his phone. He didn't talk. He just watched her, his attention steady and unervingly focused. When her set ended, she packed up her music sheets with practiced calm, pretending not to notice that he was still watching. "Excuse me," a low voice said. She turned. Up close, Daniel looked exactly like the men she'd only ever seen walking out of black cars in the city's expensive districts. Sharp jawline, clean shave, eyes the color of steel. He smiled, and it was a smile that said he was used to getting what he wanted. "You have a remarkable voice," he said. "You make this place sound better than it looks." Emily laughed politely, tasting both flattery and opportunity. "Thank you. I'm just filling in tonight." "A mistake on their part," he replied. "May I buy you a drink?" The bartender was already watching, waiting for her signal. For a moment she thought about her early call the next morning, the budget she kept scribbled in the back of her notebook, the warning her mother always gave her about strangers. Then she thought about the past due notice slid under her door that morning. "Sure," Emily said. one drink. They talked for an hour that turned into 2. She learned that Daniel was a property investor who split his time between London and the south of France. He spoke casually of villas, yachts, and late flights as if they were just items on a grocery list. He asked about her work, her dreams, why she'd left home. He listened in a way that made her feel like every word she said mattered. "You don't belong on tiny stages," he told her at one point, his gaze warm and appraising. "You belong in rooms where people have to pay to hear you." A thrill ran through her. No casting director had ever said anything like that. When she finally stepped back into the cool night air, the city seemed different, brighter, softer, bending toward her instead of turning away. Days later, he was waiting for her after another set. Then he was sending a car. Then he was taking her to restaurants where menus didn't have prices, to parties where the floors were marble and the views were all glass and skyline. Within weeks, Emily's world shifted. The cramped room above the fish and chip shop felt smaller every time she returned to it, her suitcase spilling clothes onto a sagging mattress while memories of silk sheets and sparkling views tugged at her thoughts. Daniel made it clear he wanted more than casual company. He placed a hand over hers at dinner, his tone light but firm. "I don't share," he said. "If we're doing this, it's you and me." For the first time in a long while, Emily felt chosen. She told herself this was the life she'd crossed an ocean for: elegant meals, private drivers, whispers of connections in the music world. It didn't matter that she barely knew him. It didn't matter that their ages, their worlds, their expectations were miles apart. What mattered, in that moment, was simple. Emily Carter, the girl who had once sung into a hairbrush in a cramped bedroom in Maple Ridge, was now walking into penthouses and being introduced as someone very special. And the more Daniel pulled her into his world, the more she began to believe that everything she had ever wanted was finally within reach. For a while, the new life felt like a dream gently unfolding. Emily drifted through high-rise foyers and weekend getaways as though she had been born into this world instead of stumbling into it. She learned which fork to use at formal dinners, how to pose gracefully for photos beside Daniel, and how to smile in a way that suggested ease rather than awe. She tried to memorize everything: the warmth of expensive lighting, the soft weight of designer fabrics, the delicate clink of crystal glasses. Daniel seemed pleased whenever she adapted to some new aspect of his lifestyle. He would nod subtly, as if ticking invisible boxes. "You're a fast learner," he often said, which she chose to hear as affection rather than expectation. But beneath the surface, cracks slowly formed. At first, they were small. Daniel began asking her to text him whenever she arrived somewhere. Then he asked her to stop working at the hotel bar. "It doesn't suit you anymore," he insisted. He didn't like certain friends she'd made in the city, calling them bad influences. He complained if she wore something too bright, too revealing, too casual. Yet he always wrapped these requests with compliments, telling her she deserved refinement, stability, protection. And Emily, soaking in the comfort of his approval, convinced herself that this was care, not control. Her own ambitions shifted without her noticing. Hours she once spent practicing songs or searching for auditions were now spent in boutiques, spas, and restaurants. Daniel introduced her to people in his circle: older men with quiet voices and sharp watches, women with sleek hair and polished smiles. They always seemed amused when Emily mentioned her singing. "That's cute," one woman had said with a gentle laugh. "But Daniel keeps you busy, doesn't he?" Emily smiled back, but something inside her tightened. Still, she pushed doubts aside. Each time insecurity crept in, Daniel smoothed it away with another gift, another promise, another weekend trip that made her believe the best was yet to come. Until their arguments began. The first one erupted quietly, like a candle tipping over. Emily had gone to lunch with a makeup artist she'd met during a small video shoot months earlier. When she returned to Daniel's penthouse, he was waiting in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, jaw tense. "You didn't answer my messages," he said. I didn't hear my phone, she replied, hanging her coat. It was loud inside. And you didn't think to check? His tone was flat, almost cold. Emily blinked, unsure how a casual lunch had become a confrontation. It was just a friend, she said carefully. We were catching up. With a man. He's married. That doesn't matter. Something sharp flashed in Daniel's eyes, fear, anger, something she couldn't name. Before she could respond, he softened, stepping toward her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I just worry, he murmured. People might take advantage of you. The shift disarmed her. She let out a breath and leaned into his touch. I'm okay, she said. You don't have to worry so much. But he did. And it got worse. Daniel's jealousy grew, subtle but corrosive. A missed call turned into suspicion. A delayed reply became an issue they needed to talk about. Emily stopped speaking to certain friends, afraid it would set him off. She avoided going out unless he accompanied her. She learned to anticipate his moods, smoothing over tension before it could ignite. She told herself he just cared too much. She told herself relationships required compromise. But every small change she made chipped away at the girl she had been when she first arrived in London. One night, after a formal dinner party, they argued in the car. Daniel accused her of being too friendly with a guest. His voice remained steady, but his words cut. You don't understand how you look to people, he said. I'm trying to protect you from being judged. Emily stared out the window, watching city lights smear across the glass. She felt heat rise behind her eyes, anger, humiliation, and something worse, confusion. She couldn't tell anymore whether he was right or simply rewriting her reality. The next morning, he apologized with roses and a diamond bracelet. She wore both. But the tension between them coiled tighter with each passing week. Emily felt Daniel watching her more closely, reading every expression, every hesitation. She stopped posting on social media unless he approved the photo. She started deleting messages before he could see them, even if they were harmless. She hid small pieces of herself the way people hide fragile objects during a storm. The glamorous world she had coveted now felt like a glass cage. And Daniel, so generous, so charming, so endlessly attentive, had begun to feel like a storm she could never predict. Then, just as she felt she was losing her footing completely, something inside Daniel shifted too. He became distant. Quiet. His calls grew shorter, his evenings more occupied, his sighs heavier when she asked simple questions. One night in early spring, he simply said, I think we need space. Emily froze. What does that mean? It means, he replied calmly, this isn't working anymore. The words hit her harder than she expected. She felt her chest seize, her breath shatter, her voice crack as she tried to respond. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't comfort. He simply ended it. And in the stunned, icy silence that followed, Emily realized that everything she had built her life around, every hope, every plan, every fragile piece of self-worth, had just collapsed. For the first time since she'd left Maple Ridge, she felt truly, terrifyingly alone. What she didn't yet realize was that the end of their romance was only the beginning of the darkest chapter of her life. The days after the breakup blurred into one long, aching stretch of disbelief. Emily moved out of Daniel's penthouse with only 2 suitcases and a handful of clothes he hadn't bought for her. The elevator ride down felt endless, each floor passing like a reminder of how quickly her life had unraveled. When the glass doors finally slid open to the street, she stepped into the cold air and felt as if the city had forgotten her. Her new apartment was a cramped studio near Camden, a downgrade so drastic it felt like falling through a trapdoor. The walls were thin, the heat unreliable, and the neighborhood loud at night. She told herself it was temporary, that she would get back on her feet. But every time she opened her phone and saw photos of Daniel's world, the penthouse views, the polished dinners, the glittering circles she'd once moved through. Her chest tightened with longing and humiliation. She tried reaching out to him at first. A text, then another. Then a voice message she deleted before sending. When he finally replied, it was brief and cool: "We need distance. Please respect that." The message cut deeper than she expected. Emily spiraled. Her days filled with restless pacing, sleepless nights, and a growing obsession she didn't want to name. She stalked his social media profiles, refreshing them hourly. She replayed old voice notes, trying to hear something she'd missed, some reassurance that things could go back to the way they'd been. She checked the accounts of people in his circle, hunting for signs of where he was, who he was with, whether he had replaced her. And then she saw her. A woman named Claire Henderson, elegant, blonde, smiling beside Daniel at a gallery opening. The photo wasn't staged, wasn't formal. It looked like a moment captured between two people comfortable with each other. Too comfortable. Emily's breath trembled. Her stomach knotted. She zoomed in until the pixels blurred. Claire wasn't just beautiful. She was the kind of woman who seemed born into the life Emily had fought so hard to enter. Expensive dress. Confident posture. A natural ease Emily had never been able to fake. Over the next weeks, more photos appeared. Claire at Daniel's side. Claire stepping into his car. Claire tagged at restaurants Emily had once visited with him. When Emily realized they were officially together, something inside her cracked open. She told herself she wasn't jealous, she just needed closure. She needed to understand why she had been discarded so suddenly, so cleanly. She convinced herself she deserved answers. And that's when the fixation deepened. She learned Claire's routine, her gym, her favorite cafe, the salon she visited twice a month. Emily never approached her directly, instead she lingered nearby, hiding behind sunglasses or a scarf, watching with a tight chest and a racing pulse. The more she observed, the more convinced she became that Claire had stolen something from her, something she needed to reclaim. But she also watched Daniel. He had a vacation home in the countryside, a secluded place he retreated to on weekends. Emily knew of it but had never been invited there. It was a modern cabin surrounded by tall pine trees, set far back from the road. When she discovered through social media that he and Claire were going there together, a strange mix of anger and despair rose in her like a tide. She drove out there one chilly afternoon, telling herself she only needed to see it once. Just to understand. But when she arrived, the house was empty. Quiet. Perfectly still. The door was locked, but the windows were wide and uncurtained. Through the glass she saw polished wood floors, modern furniture, and framed photographs of landscapes. The scent of pine and cold earth filled the air outside, and for a moment she felt an eerie sense of belonging, as if she were meant to be there. That moment became a decision. Emily returned the next day. And the next. Eventually, she found a window that didn't lock properly. It slid open with a soft click. And she stepped inside. The warmth of the interior wrapped around her like a forbidden comfort. She walked slowly through the rooms, touching the backs of chairs, opening drawers, brushing her fingers along countertops. She explored every corner, the bedroom she imagined he and Claire would sleep in, the living room where they would laugh together, the kitchen where he might cook her dinner the way he once cooked for Emily. Each detail stoked her torment. She began staying there when they weren't around. She slept on the couch, showered in the guest bathroom, made meals from groceries she brought herself. She cleaned meticulously to avoid leaving evidence. She moved objects only to put them back in the exact position she found them. It was a secret life, built from longing and delusion. But eventually, secrets become impossible to contain. One evening, Emily heard a car engine approach. Panic shot through her. She froze, listening as tires crunched over gravel. Voices, Daniel's deep tone, Claire's gentle laughter. Keys jingling. They were home. Emily rushed to hide, slipping into a small storage room off the hallway, pressing her back against the wall. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as footsteps crossed the threshold. Daniel's voice drifted through the house, calm and casual, completely unaware of the presence watching him from behind a thin wooden door. Emily stayed silent for hours, waiting until they were asleep in the bedroom. Only then did she slip out into the night. Her obsession no longer felt like something she controlled. It felt like something that carried her. And she had no idea that she was moving steadily toward a moment she could never undo. Emily should have walked away that night. She told herself that a dozen times as she sat in her cramped apartment, replaying every sound she'd heard while hiding inside Daniel's vacation home, the clinking glasses, the light footsteps, Claire's soft laughter drifting down the hallway. Each memory twisted inside her, pulling tighter and tighter. But obsession doesn't loosen. It coils. A week later, Daniel and Claire returned to the countryside home again. Emily knew because she'd checked their tagged photos. A weekend getaway. A quiet trip. Perfect privacy. Something inside her snapped into place, cold, resolved, trembling beneath the surface. She drove out before dawn, the sky still gray, the road damp from the night's rain. Her old car rattled through the pines until the cabin came into view, warm lights glowing behind the tall windows. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. This time, she didn't go inside. Not yet. She watched from the tree line as Daniel stepped out onto the deck, coffee mug in hand, wearing a sweater she had bought him months before. Claire appeared behind him, her hair tied loosely, her face relaxed with morning calm. They looked comfortable. Happy. Settled into a life that had once belonged to Emily. Or so she believed. She lingered until the sun sank and the windows brightened again. From a distance, she watched them make dinner, talking and laughing like they'd been together for years, not months. When Daniel brushed a hand across Claire's back as he reached for a pan, Emily felt heat rise behind her eyes, a burning shame mixed with rage. That night she slept in her car, curled under a worn blanket, shaking from cold and adrenaline. When she woke before sunrise, she knew exactly what she planned to do. She returned to the window she'd used before. It still had the faulty latch. She slipped inside silently, her breath thin and shaky. The living room was dark, the air faintly warm from the fireplace. Soft golden light flickered through the hallway from the bedroom door left slightly ajar. Emily could hear their quiet breathing, steady and peaceful. She stood there for a long moment, long enough to realize she had crossed a line she could no longer retreat from. And yet she kept walking. As the hours passed, she moved through the house like a displaced shadow, staying out of sight whenever she heard footsteps. She hid in the storage room again when Daniel walked through the hallway. She stiffened when Claire passed by humming softly. Finally, at dusk, they stepped out for a walk on the trail behind the property. The moment the door closed, Emily emerged. Her mind raced, but her movements were sharp, purposeful. She stepped into the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out a heavy flashlight. Then she unlocked the back door and slipped outside, circling around the house toward the trail. Halfway down the path, she heard their voices. Emily stepped into the open. Daniel stopped first, surprise washing over his face. Claire froze beside him. Emily? Daniel's voice was a mix of shock and anger. What are you doing here? She stood rigid, breath visible in the cool air. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about, he said firmly. You replaced me, she whispered. You threw me away. I didn't throw you away. Daniel straightened, jaw tense. We ended a relationship that wasn't healthy, for either of us. You need to leave. Claire shifted uneasily. Daniel, maybe we should. This has nothing to do with you, Emily snapped, eyes locking on her. Claire stepped back, her expression tightening. Daniel raised a hand. Emily. That's enough. You're scaring her. You shouldn't be here. Emily's breathing grew uneven. The fury she had tried to suppress spiraled upward, fueled by every memory of feeling discarded, unseen, replaced. You don't get to decide what I should do, she said, voice trembling. You owe me a conversation. You owe me an explanation. I owe you nothing, he replied. The words hit her like a slap. For a moment, no one moved. The trees rustled in the wind, scattering dry leaves across the trail. The air between them felt brittle, stretched to its breaking point. Then Claire spoke softly. Daniel, let's just go. Daniel placed a hand on Claire's arm, guiding her away. And something inside Emily broke cleanly, sharply. She stepped forward. Don't walk away from me. Daniel turned, frustration igniting. You need to stop. This is over. Go home. Emily's voice cracked. I don't have a home without you. Daniel's expression hardened. That's not my problem. Claire tugged at his sleeve. Please, let's leave. They walked past her, heading back toward the cabin. Emily stood shaking on the trail, the flashlight hanging limp in her hand. Her vision blurred as emotion swelled inside her, fear, rage, abandonment, all tangled until she couldn't separate one from the other. She followed them, quiet, controlled by a force she no longer recognized. When they reached the back door, Daniel unlocked it and ushered Claire inside. He turned back just long enough to say, Emily, don't ever come here again. He closed the door. And the click of that lock echoed through her like a gunshot. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood there in the cooling dusk, her breath steadying in a way that felt unnatural, almost detached. Then she walked around the house, slipped in through the unlatched window, and stepped quietly into the darkened hallway. What happened next would unravel everything, every life touched by this moment, every path crossed in the name of obsession. But for now, the house was silent. And Emily Carter had stepped inside with one final, irreversible purpose. The house felt unnervingly still as Emily moved through its shadows. Her footsteps were soft, nearly soundless against the wooden floor. The windows reflected the last pale streaks of dusk, casting long shapes across the walls. In the quiet, she could hear her own heartbeat, steady, deliberate, frighteningly calm. Daniel and Claire were in the living room, their voices low but strained. Emily could make out only fragments as she inched closer. Should call someone, Claire whispered. No, Daniel replied. I'll handle it. She'll leave. His tone carried a certainty that stung Emily like a fresh wound. He spoke as though she were a problem, an inconvenience, something to be handled and dismissed. Not someone he had once loved. Not someone he had once promised the world. Her throat tightened as she stepped into view. Daniel was the first to see her. He stood sharply from the couch, his expression turning from annoyance to alarm. Claire gasped, clutching at his arm. Emily, Daniel raised his hands. You need to leave. Now. I did leave, she said softly. You just didn't notice. Claire backed toward the corner of the room. Daniel, please. Call the police, he told her quietly. Emily's eyes widened with panic. Don't do that. You broke in, Daniel said. You've been here before, haven't you? She didn't answer. Her silence said enough. Daniel stepped forward, trying to keep his voice level. Emily, listen. You're not thinking clearly. This isn't the way to fix anything. You never listened to me, she whispered. Not once since the day you walked away. Her gaze flicked toward the hallway, just long enough for Daniel to move closer, reaching out as if to restrain her. Don't, she warned. Emily, stop this. The rising tension crackled in the air like a storm. Claire, trembling, moved toward her phone on the table. Emily saw the motion and stiffened. "No," she hissed. Daniel turned to block her path, and the sudden movement shattered whatever fragile restraint remained. Emily didn't remember deciding what to do. She only remembered the desperate swirl of emotion, fear of losing him forever, anger at being replaced, humiliation tightening around her chest like a vice. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small handgun. Daniel froze. Claire screamed. "Emily, put that down," Daniel said, voice suddenly steady again, cautious. "You don't want to do this." "Yes," she whispered, "I do." But even then, the truth was more complicated. It wasn't power she wanted. It wasn't revenge. It was for someone, anyone, to finally understand how much she had lost. Daniel took a slow step forward. "You're scared. I get that. But you're making a mistake you can't undo." Her hand shook, but her eyes didn't leave his. "You undid everything," she said. "Everything I tried to build." And then, in a single, chaotic moment, Daniel lunged toward her, perhaps to disarm her, perhaps to protect Claire. The gun fired. The sound exploded through the cabin, bouncing off the walls in a brutal, echoing crack. Claire screamed, stumbling backward. Daniel staggered, eyes wide with shock, his hand reaching instinctively toward the spreading stain on his chest. He fell to his knees. Emily froze, the gun dropping from her trembling fingers. She stared at Daniel as he collapsed onto the floor, gasping, eyes dizzy with pain and disbelief. "Daniel," her voice broke. I didn't mean." Claire rushed to his side, sobbing, pressing her hands desperately over the wound. "Call someone. Please. Don't just stand there." Her words pierced through the haze, but Emily didn't move. She watched the scene as if from far away, like a nightmare unfolding behind a pane of glass she couldn't break. Daniel's breaths grew shallow. His eyes unfocused. Claire looked up at Emily with raw fury. "Get out." Emily stumbled backward, tears blurring her vision. She turned and fled down the hallway, her footsteps frantic and uneven. She crawled out through the unlatched window, stumbled across the yard, and nearly collapsed beside her car. The engine roared to life as she sped away, gravel spraying behind her. By the time Claire called emergency services, by the time the first responders reached the remote cabin, by the time they tried and failed to save him, Emily was gone. The next morning, news spread that Daniel Reeves had been found fatally shot inside his own vacation home. Claire, traumatized, gave her first statement through tears. And police issued an immediate alert for a single suspect, Emily Carter. But Emily didn't run far. Days later, exhausted, disoriented, and guilt-ridden, she walked into a police station and surrendered. "I didn't mean to," she told them. "He attacked me. He tried to grab the gun. It was self-defense." But even as she spoke the words, something inside her knew the truth would catch up. And it did. Investigators would soon uncover evidence that told a very different story, one that pointed not to panic or accident, but to planning. And Emily's desperate claim of self-defense would begin to unravel, piece by devastating piece. Emily's confession sparked immediate attention, but the calmness with which she delivered it unsettled the detectives from the start. She sat in the interrogation room with her hands tightly folded, her voice thin but steady as she repeated the same claim: it was self-defense. She insisted Daniel had lunged at her, that the gun had gone off by accident, that she had been terrified. Detectives listened, but doubt flickered behind their eyes. Because the evidence told a different story. Forensic teams combed through the vacation home. They found no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no scattered objects, no defensive wounds on Daniel. Instead, they found the back window latch pried slightly open. They found footprints in the soil leading from the forest to the house, prints matching the shoes Emily wore at the time of her surrender. They found traces of food wrappers and toiletries in the storage room, indicating someone had been living inside for days. Then came the security footage from nearby traffic cameras, catching Emily's car passing through the town 3 days in a row. And the most damning piece, the small handgun, recovered from the spot where she had dropped it, was registered not to Daniel, but to a pawn shop she had visited 2 weeks prior. Her story began falling apart. When confronted with the findings, Emily grew agitated. She insisted she had bought the gun only for protection. She claimed she hadn't planned anything, that she had simply wanted to talk. But every new detail painted a clearer, colder picture of her intent. Prosecutors charged her with murder and unlawful entry. The trial drew wide attention, partly because of Daniel's wealth and community influence, and partly because of Emily's dramatic rise and fall, from an aspiring performer chasing dreams in a foreign city to the accused in a high-profile homicide case. In court, Emily appeared fragile and restless. She kept her eyes low, often trembling as the prosecution laid out the timeline. They showed her social media activity, the photos she'd saved of Daniel and Claire, the messages she had never sent. They displayed maps marking her repeated trips to the cabin. They presented expert witnesses who testified that the gunshot was fired from a steady angle, not one typical of struggle or chaos. Claire took the stand, voice shaking as she described the confrontation and the moment the gun went off. She wept as she relived the scene, and her quiet grief echoed through the silent courtroom. The defense tried to portray Emily as unstable, desperate, overwhelmed by heartbreak. They argued that she had acted impulsively, that she had not intended to harm Daniel, that emotional collapse had driven her actions. But the jury saw the planning. The fixation. The dangerous lengths she had gone to. They saw a pattern, not a moment. After 6 hours of deliberation, they returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Emily stood motionless as the words landed. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only lowered her head as the judge delivered her sentence, years in prison for the killing and the unlawful entry. For Daniel's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice. But justice is not the same as closure. His sister later told reporters that losing Daniel felt like losing the center of their world, that no verdict, no sentence, could ever restore what had been taken from them. In prison, Emily kept to herself. She avoided interviews, ignored letters from tabloids, and spent her days reading, writing, and trying not to remember the person she had once been. Time passed slowly, marked by the echo of closing cell doors and the distant murmurs of other inmates. Then, after several appeals and a legal review of sentencing guidelines, her punishment was reduced. Good behavior shortened it further. Years later, Emily Carter walked out of prison earlier than anyone expected. She stepped into a world that had moved on without her, a world where Daniel Reeves was remembered not for his successes, but for the tragic way his life ended. His loved ones had gathered every year on the anniversary of his death, leaving flowers outside the cabin he once cherished. They had tried to heal, to breathe, to continue living in the shadow of grief. Her release reopened wounds that had barely begun to scar. Daniel's family spoke publicly, expressing heartbreak and disbelief. They said the early release felt like a second loss, a reminder that time had softened her punishment, even though their pain remained as sharp as ever. As Emily disappeared from public view, attempting to rebuild whatever life she could, the family continued searching for peace, though none seemed within reach. His mother once said in a quiet interview, "Closure isn't something you find. It's something you learn to live without." And in the quiet corners of Maple Ridge, in the distant halls of London, in the silent woods surrounding a lonely cabin, the echoes of obsession, heartbreak, and irreversible choices lingered. In the end, no one walked away unscarred.